An act which is worthy of mention is the reorganization of the Audit Office. This important measure, which followed closely upon the suppression of the tribunate, has been praised as an act of wise government, the Budget Committee having been admitted to be insufficient. But even the best things are open to criticism, and fault has been found with the fact that the annual balance sheet submitted to the sovereign was not made public, and that only the budgets of communes possessing an income of over 10,000 francs a year were audited. The first point was rectified by a subsequent order, by the terms of which the report of the Audit Office had to be annexed to the accounts laid before the legislature each year. It was in the government's interest to develop this system of public bookkeeping as much as possible, and the reasons for finding fault with the institution of the Audit Office were bound to disappear. Experience and the restoration of peace would have brought with them reforms in turn, as well as the improvement of many other services for which time was lacking. As Napoleon himself used to say, time is the great master of all things. Monsieur Barbé Marbois, from whom the emperor had been forced to withdraw the portfolio of the public treasury, in 1806 received by his nomination to the presidency of the Audit Office a fresh proof of Napoleon's appreciation of his past services. Very different conduct from that of people who, in the day of adversity, have forgotten the injuries they committed against the man who had put a stop to their exile or their proscription, only to remember the disgrace, too often fully merited, which had befallen them later. One of the principal reasons which had induced Napoleon to sign the Peace of Tilsit was the necessity of securing fresh means for excluding England from the continent. With this object in view, he exerted all the forces of his intelligence and began by weighing with all his influence on Spain to obtain from this degenerate power an increase of effort against the common enemy. He exacted in consequence the cooperation of the Spanish government in forcing Portugal to accept and carry out the continental system. The emperor, on his side, had summoned to the Lisbon cabinet to close the ports of Portugal against the English, to seize upon English subjects and merchandise, and to declare war against England. The Portuguese government had not heeded these behests. A secret understanding which the English government did not conceal in Parliament existed between England and Portugal, and tended to the evasion by the latter of the decrees of Berlin. Napoleon decided in consequence to fight this country. He assembled an army of 25,000 French soldiers under the command of General Junto near Bayonne, and ordered them to invade Portugal. The emperor occupied himself in conjunction with the Minister of Marines, de Grace, in preparing small maritime expeditions with the object of ruining British trade and shipping in the waters of the island of France, of the Antilles, and on the coasts of Africa. He applied his indefatigable activity to increasing the number of naval constructions, to the creation of new maritime establishments, and, in one word, to every development of the resources of the French Navy. His attention was at the same time directed to the best means for providing for the needs of the Treasury by admitting the finances of the state to share in the profits of the war indemnities. This same zeal for the public good extended itself likewise to public works, to the protection required by commerce and industry, to the reform of the magistracy, to the improvement of the positions of the parish priests, to the advancement of science, art, and literature. The feast of Saint Napoleon was celebrated with general enthusiasm. The Peace of Tilsit and the hope that it would be followed by peace at sea opened every heart to confidence. On the morrow, August 16th, Napoleon opened the session of the legislative body with pomp, which was further increased by the presence of an immense concourse of people. In his speech delivered in a firm and sonorous voice which thrilled the assembly, Napoleon related what he had done for the greatness and happiness of France, and described the plans which he was meditating for the perfecting of our institutions. This solemn session was terminated by a statement of the magnificent situation of the French Empire. The Senatus Consultum, announced 1 year previously, which created hereditary nobility, issued from C. This general state of prosperity. The creation of hereditary titles was the natural sequence of the foundation of the empire and the creation of the principalities which had been conferred in 1806. On March 1st, 1807, there had been registered at the Senate 2 statutes, one providing for the creation of titles of princes, dukes, counts, barons, and knights, the other establishing the regulation of the institution and composition of settled estates. The nobility founded by Napoleon was no more in opposition to the principles of equality than the institution of the Legion of Honor. That is what distinguished it from the old nobility, which had been a privileged and feudal aristocracy. The new nobility was injured by what was remembered of the old. The imperial nobility would have needed, before being judged, to have undergone the developments which time would have brought with it. It was the fruit of an idea of organization, which, as Napoleon used to say, would have characterized the century. The old aristocracy formed an association outside the people, which, separated from it by almost insurmountable barriers, was naturally hostile towards it. In creating a new nobility, open to merit of every kind, Napoleon counterpoised our old closed aristocracy and prepared its transformation. In the emperor's mind, the imperial nobility restored the equality which had been prescribed by the old nobility. Napoleon wished to realize 3 important objects: the amalgamation of old France with the new France, the reconciliation of France with Europe, and the effacement in Europe of the vestiges of feudality by attaching the idea of nobility to services rendered to the state. The superiority which the old nobility arrogated to itself would have been effaced by its fusion with the new. The Princess of Beauvau, whose merits and attachment the emperor highly esteemed, hearing that her eldest son had been created a baron, could only bring herself by force to recognize a favor in this gift of a title. She ignored that her son would have recovered in time the title to which he had a right. The members of the ancient nobility, bearing names recommended by ancient services or remarkably illustrious, would have resumed the titles they had formerly borne after the peace under conditions which would have made the 2 nobilities one historical nobility. The emperor had distributed on June 30th and September 23rd sums of from 200,000 to 1 million francs to each of 9 marshals, sums of 100,000 francs to each of 34 generals. In one word, revenues exceeding a total sum of 1,500,000 francs. These cash sums did not cost the treasury 1 halfpenny, for they were taken from the war indemnities levied on the enemy and paid into a special army treasury. The endowments consisted in domains which Napoleon had reserved to himself in Poland, Hanover, Westphalia, Holland, and Italy. The Arch-Chancellor and the Arch-Treasurer, several ministers, and other civil functionaries had a share in the given proportion in these liberalities. I'm only speaking of those who had a first share in these gifts before and after the emperor's fete. For in proportion as victory put these riches into Napoleon's hands, new sums of money and new endowments were used as rewards for old and new services, both military and civil. Nor were the foreigners who had assisted in our victories forgotten. The total resources supplied by conquest composed the extraordinary domain, and this domain was exclusively used for rewarding services rendered to France. And Napoleon always abstained from applying any part of it to his personal use. The emperor always wanted me to get married. He was constantly speaking to me on this subject. He was constantly saying, "Well, when are we going to get married?" I had time to think the matter over, but I was so jealous of my independence that I did not want the emperor or the empress to interfere in my marriage. It was only later that I determined to face this great problem, which was solved to my entire satisfaction. I selected my wife from an honorable family, and in making my choice was not influenced by anybody else. I did not regret what I had done, for the future which opened before us was sufficiently bright to satisfy all our ambitions. The emperor, when freedom from worry gave the reins to his benevolence, had more than once said to me, "You have had the fortune to rise with me. I must make your fortune. Peace will at last come to enable me to settle my accounts. You will lose nothing by waiting. I quote these words, which penetrated into my heart too deeply for me to forget them. He puts that and other matters off till the period which he so earnestly hoped for. After his second abdication in 1815, the emperor expressed his regret to me at not having been able to keep his promises. Napoleon spent the last days of September, the whole of October, and half the month of November at Fontainebleau. He had given orders 2 years previously for great improvements in this sumptuous residence, and he had considerably added to the splendid furniture of the palace. He received many foreigners and German princes there. Diplomatic introductions took place here, and the court at Fontainebleau was a very brilliant one. Hunting, theatrical performances of the masterpieces of French stage, in which Talma, our principal actors, took part, were a diversion from the serious business with which the emperor was taken up. England's answer to the proposals of France and Russia, and to Russia's offer of acting as mediator, had been the bombardment of Copenhagen. Portugal, who was bound to England by her sympathies and interests, had evaded all cooperation in the efficacious measures adopted by the naval powers against the excesses of English tyranny. The Lisbon cabinet, enslaved by the London cabinet, maintained an attitude of hidden hostility in face of our claims. The emperor decided to punish this perfidy and to strike a new blow against England by occupying Portugal. A convention was signed on October 27th at Fontainebleau between General Duroc and Monsieur Izquierdo, a Spanish gentleman who was engaged in the study of natural history in Paris and who was the devoted agent of the Prince de la Paix. The object of this convention was to settle the basis of the occupation of Portugal by an army of 25,000 men, to which was to be joined a Spanish army of the same force, General Junot, commanding the observation corps, which was assembled at Bayonne, received orders to cross the frontier and to march upon Lisbon by the military route agreed upon with the Spanish government. The emperor at the same time gave orders for the formation of a second army and entrusted its command to General Dupont, whose military talents he had reason to appreciate during the 1805 campaign. This second army had the same destination as the first and was to enter Spain to assist it in case the English joined the Portuguese. The same plenipotentiary signed a treaty which divided Portugal into 3 parts, the first part of which was given to the King of Etruria in exchange for Tuscany. The second was to form a principality in favor of the Prince de la Paix, who was pleased at the prospect of having an assured independence in case events forced him to cease his rule in Spain. As to the third part, it was kept in reserve for the purposes of future exchange or to be bestowed in a way of recompense. The reversion of these territories was reserved in default of legitimate heirs to the King of Spain, whom the emperor undertook to have acknowledged as the emperor of the 2 Americas, as soon as the general peace should have been effected. 2 days later, a treaty was signed with the envoy from Denmark, also at Fontainebleau. The Crown Prince of Denmark, profoundly incensed by the odious conduct of the English ministry and by the barbarous aggression of which his people had been the victims, had rejected all the proposals of England, answering them with a declaration of war, after having denounced the Copenhagen outrage to the whole of Europe. This prince had taken just reprisals by arresting all English subjects, by confiscating their property, by ordering all money due to them to be sequestrated, and by forbidding all communication with England under pain of death. He made common cause with France, on whose support he could rely, and with Russia, whose alliance offered less guarantee of sincerity. Napoleon took into his service the Danish sailors who had been thrown out of work by the capture or destruction of the ships on which they had been engaged. It was during the last fortnight of his stay at Fontainebleau that the emperor received a letter dated from Escurial, October 29, 1807, in which King Charles IV informed him of the discovery of a conspiracy against his throne and the Queen's life, a conspiracy at the head of which was the Prince of the Asturias, the eldest son of the Spanish monarch. The emperor, without placing faith in this serious accusation, saw in the circumstance another proof of the deep misunderstanding which separated the sovereign's favorite and the heir to the Spanish crown. On the other hand, Napoleon had received a letter transmitted by Monsieur de Beauharnais, our ambassador in Madrid, some days before the King of Spain's letter. This letter came from the Prince of the Asturias, who wrote to the emperor, without his father's knowledge, to implore his protection against the enemies who had decided upon his ruin, and to ask him for the hand of one of the princesses of his family. These letters brought back before Napoleon's mind the thoughts concerning Spain, which he had long been meditating. He had long and frequent conversations on this subject with the Prince de Benevento Talleyrand, who, seeking to penetrate the emperor's secret thoughts, had skillfully seized upon this opportunity of rendering himself useful. Talleyrand, as a matter of fact, did obtain the favor of being allowed to replace Prince Eugene as Arch-Chancellor of State during his absence. This title conferred upon Prince Eugene a dignity without diplomatic functions. Monsieur de Talleyrand expected to derive more serious advantages from his honorary title in the course of confidential conversations with Napoleon, conversations in which he chiefly played the part of a listener. He hinted the advice, with all the semblances of a studied reserve, that the emperor should take advantage of the misunderstandings which divided the court of Spain to change the dynasty, which would never be a useful ally against England, and which, under circumstances which could not fail to arise, would on the contrary favor this power to our disadvantage. As an alternative to this extreme measure, he proposed that a surrender of territory should be obtained from Spain to the extent of making her dependent upon us. I was present at several of these conversations, which used frequently to be held in the emperor's workroom. Napoleon took his time to reflect on this serious matter. Before being able to come to any decision himself, events had to be allowed to ripen with time. He did not answer the letter of the Prince of the Asturias, considering it as an attack on the authority of the head of the royal family. He had a declaration made to the Prince de Macerano, at that time Spanish ambassador to France, that it did not suit him to interfere in the domestic affairs of the Spanish sovereign. He answered King Charles, advising him to exercise indulgence and moderation, and made his preparations for his journey to Italy, without having expressed himself in any pronounced way, and leaving the whole matter in suspense. During his stay at Fontainebleau, the emperor had granted an audience to Madame de Bonchamp, the widow of the Vendéan general of that name, who, dragged into the Revolutionary War by a feeling of honor, used to say that he aimed after no human glory because civil wars can never confer it. His generous conduct won him the esteem of men of all parties. With his dying breath, he had saved the lives of 6,000 patriots, whose death was being clamored for by the Vendéans. Napoleon, anxious to honor the memory of this distinguished warrior, received his widow with kindness and promised to endow her daughter, a child of 12 or 13, whom she presented to him. He had a rather long conversation with Madame de Bonchamp, and heard with interest that she herself had been saved from a death sentence by a conventional, a man called l'official, whose name Napoleon heard then for the first time. L'official, after having the sentence which condemned Madame de Bonchamp as the widow of a Vendéan general to death respited, and had obtained an amnesty in which her name was included by his care. Napoleon did not limit his interest towards Madame de Bonchamp to sterile expressions of favor, and granted her a pension of 6,000 francs.